The letter came on a market day, which was, as everyone later agreed, the least remarkable circumstance of the whole affair. It arrived folded into the same leather satchel that carried the weekly household accounts, tucked beneath a bill from the chandler and a note from the vicar about the church roof, so that Lady Iris Faraday did not notice it at all until she had already dealt with both. She was 25 years old, and she had been mistress of Bramblewick Cottage, a modest, ivy-throated house on the eastern edge of her husband's vast holdings, for the better part of 2 years, ever since it had become clear, without either of them saying so aloud, that the Duke of Harcastle preferred his wife at a comfortable distance. The arrangement suited them both in its way. He managed his acres and his ledgers and his correspondence with the cool, unhurried competence of a man who had never in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. She managed the smaller economy of Bramblewick, the linen and the larder and the modest garden, and told herself, some mornings more convincingly than others, that this was enough. The letter, when she finally opened it, was in the Duke's own narrow hand. It informed her, with the courteous brevity he reserved for matters he considered beneath lengthy explanation, that he was assigning to her personal management the property known as Nettlecombe Farm, 400 acres on the western boundary of the estate, presently untenanted, presently unproductive, and presently, in the words of his steward's last report, not worth the labor of clearing it. She read the paragraph twice, the way she read most things that mattered, wanting to be certain she had not mistaken his meaning. She had not. He was giving her a farm that the whole county called worthless, and he was calling it, in the same careful language he used for everything he wished to be misunderstood, as generous, an opportunity for her to occupy her time as she saw fit. Iris set the letter down upon the kitchen table, beside the seed chest that had sat there, closed, since the day it arrived with the last of her mother's effects 3 years before. She did not open it. Not yet. She only rested her hand upon its lid, feeling the old grain of the wood beneath her palm, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her by how little it troubled her, that her husband had just handed her exactly the sort of problem she had been raised to solve. She had grown up the daughter of a Yorkshire tenant farmer who had, through obstinacy and a genuine gift for the land, worked a hillside no one else wanted into the most productive 40 acres in the parish. She had walked those fields at his side from the time she could walk at all, had learned to read soil the way other girls learn to read music, by ear, by feel, by the particular silence of ground that has given all it has to give. Her father had died when she was 19, and the farm had gone, as such things went, to a cousin with no interest in it and every intention of selling. She had married the Duke a year later, for reasons that had made sense to her family and considerably less sense to her, and had spent 3 years since learning the particular loneliness of being useful to no one. She rose the next morning before the frost had lifted and asked Mrs. Pardew, her housekeeper, to have the trap made ready. The road to Nettlecombe ran west from the village of Longmere along a lane that grew rougher the farther it went, as though the land itself wished to discourage visitors. Iris made the journey with a wind at her back that smelled of wet stone and old hay, and arrived, a little past 9, at a farm that told its own story before she had climbed down from the trap.
We can bring this place back. It will take time, but I know where to begin.
The fences along the boundary had collapsed in 3 places, the rails silvered with age and rot. The fields beyond lay cracked and pale, the soil gone the color of ash from seasons of drought and neglect, with only a scattering of thistle and sorrel to suggest that anything would grow there at all. A stone farmhouse stood at the center of it, sound enough in its bones but hollow-eyed, its windows shuttered, its chimney cold. Behind it, an old walled orchard had gone to briar, the apple trees inside it grown wild and untended, their branches crossing one another like arguments that had never been resolved. At the gate she found a man waiting, not for her, she understood at once, but simply because he had nowhere else to be. He was perhaps 60, thick-set, with the weathered, patient face of a man who had spent his whole life watching weather come and go without asking his permission. "You'll be the Duchess," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am Lady Faraday," she said. "And you are?" "Josiah Rudd. Foreman, such as there is one to be foreman of." He looked past her at the fields with an expression that was not quite despair, but had learned to live very near it. "There's nothing here worth your ladyship's time, if you'll forgive my saying so." "I haven't decided that yet," Iris said, and asked him to walk the boundary with her. She spent for hours at Nettlecombe that first day, and she did not once take his word for anything she could examine herself. She knelt in the driest fields and worked the soil between her fingers, testing its crumble, its color, the faint mineral smell of ground that has been worked too hard and rested too little. She walked the orchard wall and found, beneath the briar, trees that were not dead, only starved of light and pruning, old stock, well chosen, planted by someone who had understood what he was doing before neglect had undone him. She found the old well behind the farmhouse, its stone lip cracked, its bucket rope rotted through, and lowered a stone on a length of twine to discover that the water beneath, though low, was not gone. "The land's been asked the same question every year for a decade," she said to Rudd, more to herself than to him, as she stood at last in the yard with the light going long and gold across the broken fences. No wonder it stopped answering. "Meaning, my lady. Meaning it needs to rest before it can work. And it needs water it isn't presently getting, and light in that orchard, and hands that believe there's something here worth the trouble." She looked at him directly. "Do you believe that, Mr. Rudd?" He was quiet a long moment. "I believed it once," he said. "A man can go a long time between believing things, though, if nobody asks him to." "Then I am asking," she said, and something in his face shifted, cautiously, like a door opening only as far as it needed to. She drove home that evening with a notebook full of observations and a plan already forming in the quiet, methodical part of her mind that had never really stopped being her father's daughter. That night she sat at the kitchen table and, for the first time in 3 years, opened the seed chest. Inside, wrapped in paper gone soft with age, were the seeds her mother had saved and labeled across 2 decades of harvests: turnip and clover, vetch and rye grass, the old rotations her father had sworn by, the ones that fed the soil instead of only taking from it. Iris sat with the chest open before her for a long while, running her fingers over the small paper packets, and felt something settle in her chest that she did not have a tidy name for. Then she took out her pen and began, in her neat and even hand, to write to the seed merchant in Corbray for what the chest did not hold. The work at Nettlecombe began in earnest before the month was out, and it began, as such work always must, with water. The old well was cleared and its stonework repaired by a retired army carpenter named Elias Cobb, who had settled in Longmere after Waterloo and who approached the well's failing timber with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had built bridges under worse conditions and did not consider a farm well any great trial. He also, at Iris's request, fashioned a simple channel of sluices to carry the water from the well and a newly cleared spring at the field's northern edge down across the driest ground, so that for the first time in years the land had something more reliable to depend upon than the sky's uncertain generosity. The soil itself she treated the way her father had treated his hillside, not all at once, and not everywhere the same. She had Rudd and the 2 laborers she hired from the village turn under a green crop of clover on the worst fields to rest and feed them, while the better ground was sown at once with turnip and rye in the rotation her mother's seeds made possible. She was not impatient with the land. She understood, in a way that the previous stewards evidently had not, that ground exhausted by years of poor use could not be commanded back into fertility by will alone, only coaxed and fed and given time. The orchard she gave to a man named Tobias Fenwick, an old shepherd from beyond Longmere who had, in his younger years, apprenticed briefly to a fruit grower before the wool trade claimed him, and who still spoke of pruning with the wistful precision of a man recalling an old love. He cleared the briar from beneath the apple trees with his own hands over the course of a fortnight, and cut back the crossing branches to let light reach the fruiting wood, and told Iris, the first time she walked the orchard with him after his work, that 3 of the oldest trees were of a variety he had not seen growing anywhere else in the county. Older than the wall around them, I'd wager, he said, laying his hand against the gnarled bark of the largest, a tree so old and twisted it seemed to have given up on symmetry generations ago and found its own peace with the decision. They'll bear again, my lady. Give them a season. Then we shall give them a season, she said, and meant it as more than a remark about fruit. The beekeeper, a widow named Agatha Prowse who kept hives on the edge of Longmere Common and had a reputation, not entirely affectionate, for speaking her mind without asking whether it was wanted, was persuaded to bring 3 of her hives to the recovering orchard once the blossom threatened to come thick in spring. She drove a harder bargain over the arrangement than anyone else on the farm had yet attempted, and Iris respected her considerably more for it. "You'll take a fair share of the honey for the trouble," Mrs. Prowse informed her, "and I'll take a fair share of your apples, and neither of us will pretend the other's doing the favor, because neither of us is." "Agreed," Iris said, and they shook hands over it like 2 merchants who had each got exactly what they wanted, which was very nearly the truth. By the time the blossom came in April, the orchard hummed with bees and the fields showed their first true green in years, and the village of Longmere had begun, in the unhurried way villages take note of things, to notice that something at Nettlecombe had changed. It was Simon Latch, the blacksmith, who mended the broken ploughshares and the gate hinges at cost rather than at profit, because, as he told Rudd over the forge one afternoon, a farm that's trying is a farm worth the iron. It was Nell Yarrow, the old herbalist who lived at the edge of the common in a cottage thick with drying bunches of feverfew and tansy, who came unbidden one morning to look at a blight beginning on the young turnip leaves and told Iris, with the flat authority of 60 years' practice, exactly which weed to burn and which to leave, and saved the crop a week before it might have been lost. It was Reverend Aldous Pell, the vicar of Longmere, who mentioned from his pulpit, in the mild and roundabout way clergymen have of being useful, that a farm was in want of honest labourers, and by the following Sunday 2 families who had been scraping a living from parish relief had walked the 4 miles to Nettlecombe to ask for work. And it was a boy named Tam Fossey, an orphan of perhaps 11 who had been living rough between the almshouse and whatever barn would have him, who appeared at the farm gate one wet morning in May and asked, with the particular bravado of a child who expects to be turned away and has decided to ask anyway, whether there was work for someone small enough to get between the hedgerows where the sheep kept escaping. There was. Iris gave him a place minding the small flock she had begun that spring with 6 ewes bought cheap from a farmer over in the next parish who had thought them not worth the feeding through another lean winter, and within a month the boy could name every one of them and had developed, without anyone teaching him to, an instinct for which was about to go wrong before it went wrong. Mrs. Biddle, the cook Iris had installed at the farmhouse to feed the growing number of hands working there, took to slipping him extra bread without comment, and Iris, who noticed everything, said nothing about that either, because some kindnesses did not require acknowledgement to do their work. By midsummer, Nettlecombe Farm had ceased to be a joke told in the taproom at Longmere and become, instead, a subject of genuine and slightly bewildered local interest. The first cutting of clover hay was better than any the parish had seen in years. The turnip crop, sown according to the old rotation and fed by the new water channels, came in thick and clean. The orchard, given its season as promised, bore fruit in a quantity that surprised even Fenwick, and Mrs. Prowse's hives produced honey enough that she and Iris between them supplied 3 grocers in Corbray before the summer was out. It was in Corbray, in fact, that Iris made the acquaintance of Aubrey Nash, a grain merchant of considerable standing and considerably more scepticism, who received her first letter proposing a supply arrangement with the polite disbelief of a man who did not expect a lady's signature to represent anything more substantial than a lady's whim. He arrived at Nettlecombe in July to see for himself, and left 3 hours later, having walked the fields and tasted the honey and eaten one of Mrs. Biddle's apple tarts, with a signed contract and the faintly stunned expression of a man revising, in real time, his entire understanding of a transaction. "I confess, my lady," he said as he took his leave, "I came expecting to be disappointed on your behalf. I find myself disappointed only in my own expectations." "That is generally the more useful sort of disappointment to have," Iris said, and he laughed, and told everyone in Corbray Market for a fortnight afterward that the Duke of Harcastle's wife knew more about grain than half the merchants who traded in it. The Duke himself, through all of this, remained at Harcastle Hall, a distance of some 12 miles that might as well have been 100 for all it seemed to trouble him. He received her quarterly reports. She had begun sending them in April, unbidden, 12 pages of figures and observations that she wrote with the same plain, unemotional precision she gave to everything, expecting no reply and receiving none, and he read them, though she did not know it, with a frown that had less to do with displeasure than with the slow, reluctant dismantling of an assumption he had not realized he'd been so comfortable holding. He heard other things too, in the way a man of his position always does, second-hand and sideways. His steward mentioned, with the careful neutrality of a servant reporting something he has not been asked to have an opinion about, that Nettlecombe's rents were being collected in full for the first time in a decade. A neighbour remarked at dinner, with the mild malice of gossip dressed as pleasantry, that his wife appeared to have accomplished with a ruined farm what his own steward had failed to accomplish with a productive one. His aunt, Lady Vesper, informed him over tea that half of Corbray now spoke of the Duchess of Harcastle's honey as though it were a minor miracle of Providence, and asked, with the particular sharpness of an old woman who has decided to enjoy herself at a relative's expense, whether he intended to visit and see it, or merely to keep hearing about it from everyone except the person responsible. He went in August, and told no one beforehand, which was, for a man of his habits, itself a small admission. He arrived at Nettlecombe on a warm afternoon with the harvest just beginning, and stood for a long while at the gate before he opened it, looking at what lay beyond, fields gold and green and orderly where he remembered only cracked earth and thistle, an orchard heavy with fruit where he remembered briar, a farmyard busy with labourers and children, and the particular unhurried industry of a place that has stopped merely surviving and begun, instead, to thrive. He found Iris in the orchard, standing beneath the oldest and most crooked of the apple trees with Fenwick beside her, discussing the timing of the picking, and she saw him before he spoke, and did not startle, because she had, in the quiet way she prepared for most things, already imagined this moment several times over. "Your Grace," she said. "I did not send word," he said. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion." "It is your farm," she said. "You require no invitation to visit it." He looked for a moment as though he might dispute the phrase "your farm," and then did not. He walked the fields with her instead, slowly, saying little, looking at the water channels Cobb had built and the mended fences and the clean stone of the repaired well, and at the end of it he stood at the orchard wall with an expression she had genuinely never seen on him in 3 years of marriage, not pride, quite, and not the cool satisfaction of a man confirming a good investment, but something closer to a man discovering that he had misjudged not merely a piece of land, but the person he had handed it to. "I gave you this farm," he said at last, believing it would fail. "I know," she said. "You did not trouble to hide it." "I should have troubled more." He was quiet a moment, looking at the old apple tree above them, its branches heavy now with fruit it had not carried in years. "I have your reports. I have read every one of them. I did not understand, until I stood here, what the figures were describing." "Figures rarely explain themselves," Iris said. "They only tell you that something is true. They do not tell you why." He looked at her then, directly, in a way he had not, she realized, looked at her in a very long time. "Then tell me why," he said. She considered the question honestly, because she was not a woman given to answering questions she had not properly considered. "Because the land was never worthless," she said. "It was only tired and unattended, and no one had troubled to ask what it needed rather than what it owed. I have found that to be true of a great many things, Your Grace, not only farms." He did not answer that at once. The bees moved in the branches above them, and somewhere across the orchard wall Tam Foss's voice carried, calling one of the ewes by name with the particular exasperated affection of a boy who has grown fond of his charges despite every intention of remaining professionally detached from sheep. The Duke reached into his coat and drew out, with a faint and unfamiliar hesitance, a small object he had evidently been carrying for some time, a seed packet, one of her mother's, labelled in Iris's own hand, which had fallen from the seed chest on the kitchen table the one evening he had called at Bramblewick unannounced in June and found her working over her ledgers, and which he had picked up, meaning to return it, and had somehow never quite managed to. "I believe this is yours," he said. She took it from him, and something passed between them that neither troubled to name, because some understandings did not require the indignity of being spoken aloud to be entirely real. If you've been walking beside Iris from the very beginning, and you haven't yet subscribed, this is a lovely place to do so. Stories like these are built slowly, with patience, quiet victories, and moments that linger long after the page is turned. Stay with us, because Iris's journey is about to leave an even deeper mark. By the following autumn, Nettlecombe Farm supplied grain to Corbray and honey to 3 parishes beyond it, and the families who had walked for miles that spring to ask for work had cottages of their own on the farm's land, and gardens, and children who no longer went hungry through the lean months, because Nettlecomb's harvest was generous enough, now, to be shared beyond its own boundary without missing what it gave. The old joke about the worthless acres had died quietly somewhere in the space of a year, replaced by a newer and more grudging local wisdom, which held that the Duchess of Harcastle could grow wheat on a church roof if someone were foolish enough to wager against her. The seed chest sat, that winter, not closed on the kitchen table at Bramblewick, but open on a shelf at Nettlecomb's farmhouse, its packets refilled each autumn from the farm's own harvest, ready for the next year's sowing, no longer a relic of what her mother had left behind, but the first page of something Iris was still writing. The Duke came often now, and stayed longer each time, and once, walking the orchard with her in the low gold light of a September evening while the last of the apples came down into Fenwick's baskets, he admitted, in the plain unadorned way of a man who has finally run out of better ways to avoid saying a true thing, that he had given her Nettlecombe expecting to be spared the trouble of admiring her, and had instead spent a year learning no other subject half so well. "I misjudged you entirely," he said. "You did," Iris agreed, without unkindness. "Most people misjudge what they have not troubled to look at closely. I have found that a farm and a person are not so very different in that regard." He looked at her for a long moment, and then at the orchard around them, the old crooked tree still standing, heavier with fruit than anyone had thought it capable of bearing, the bees settling for the evening, the smoke rising steady from the farmhouse chimney where Mrs. Biddle was readying supper for hands who had earned it, and said nothing further, because there was, by then, very little left that needed saying, and a great deal that simply needed to go on being true.